So we're in Ecclesiastes chapter 4, and let's just kind of remember the journey that we've been on so far. We talked about we believe this is the wisdom of Solomon, and the prologue, where he gave us a lot of conclusions, is life under the sun without God is absolutely meaningless. It's cyclical, things repeat. All the stuff that you do at the end of the day doesn't really matter because you're just going to die and somebody else is going to fill those shoes. No one's going to remember you. So what's the point anyway? Really joyful, happy stuff in Ecclesiastes. Life is meaningless. And so chapter 2, really at the end of chapter 1, he sets out his quest. I'm going to seek by wisdom to find fulfillment in life under the sun. So he tries earthly pleasures, he tries wisdom, earthly knowledge, and he tries labors under the sun, and it doesn't fulfill. He actually says there's some short-term fulfillment in some of these things, but there's no long-term fulfillment in any of this. And then in chapter 3, we see some more of this. Hey, life is predictable, but it's also really unpredictable. There's a time under the sun for everything to happen. And whether it happens in your lifetime or not, those things are just going to happen. And the whole breadth of human experience is going to happen regardless of what you do. And that can be really depressing. But then in chapter 3, we saw really for the first time after the prologue that God comes into the picture. And in a really big way, God comes into the picture, and it really changes everything. Time is not the controlling factor. God is. And that changes the way that you view everything. So that brings us up to chapter 4. So before we even dive in, are there any comments on chapters 1 through 3 or anything about Solomon before we get into chapter 4? All right. Well, let's dive into chapter 4. Let's go ahead and start. Let's read the first 3 verses. And before we do that, let's read the last question that was mentioned in chapter 3. Just remember, we're giving special attention when Solomon asks questions. And so in verse 22, I have seen nothing is better that man should be happy in his activities, for that is his lot. For who will bring him to see what will occur after him? And so the question there was, who's going to let a guy see what happens after him after he dies? And the implicit answer there is no one. You can't know what's going to happen after you die because you're already dead. And I think that's significant because in chapter 4, as nice and fuzzy as a lot of chapter 3 felt because God's in the picture in a big way, chapter 4 is going to be very, very bleak. There's going to be some good stuff that happens, but chapter 4 is going to be very bleak. So man doesn't know what's going to happen after him. But in chapter 4, Solomon's going to give a really bleak view of what humans see in their days in life under the sun. So chapter 4, let's look at the first 3 verses here. First, Ecclesiastes 4 here in verses 2 and 3. So we've got these acts of oppression that are happening, inhumane acts, man to man. You've got on the side of the oppressed, there's tears and it's bad. But even on the side of the oppressors, there's no one to comfort them. It's almost like you think of a corporate ladder, the higher up you go, the lonelier it can get, is sort of the idea that's here. And so his conclusions here in verses 2 and 3 are really dreary, to say the least. Because verse 2, he says, I congratulated the dead who are already dead more than the living who are still living. That it's better to be dead than to see these acts of inhumanity, than to see these oppressive acts being done and taking place here. Better are those who are already dead. And thinking about this, I was thinking about trying to think from Solomon's perspective. I don't know if he would think this, but it just got me thinking. Is he thinking of people who are already dead for a long time? Because some in the Hebrew there, it could suggest that they've already been dead for a long time. That's why he says already dead. So imagine if Moses could see the state of Jerusalem at this point. Would he be pleased? Kind of seems like Solomon's saying, no, it's better to be Moses and be already dead than see the state of the people and the inhumane acts that are happening. And so I tried to connect that to us a little bit. And it's like, think about Peter and Paul. If they could jump forward in the future and see the state of, I don't know, Christians in the world or people who call themselves Christians in the world, would they be happy? Would they be pleased? I don't know. But it seems like from what Solomon is saying is it's better to be already dead than to see these inhumane acts and the oppression and all the things that are happening under the sun. But even more than that, he says, but better off than those who are already dead is the people who never lived in the first place. I mean, that's huge, isn't it? We're going to see some more of that throughout Ecclesiastes, but he's saying it's better to never exist and never see these inhumane actions, the oppression that happens under the sun. It's just not worth seeing. And it's better not even to have lived at all. It's evil activity. And that's a really big deal. Any thoughts on verses 1 through 3 about oppression and oppressors? Life under the sun? Okay. Well, if you think of something, let me know. Let's keep going here. And verses 4 through 12, one of the difficult things about Ecclesiastes, some things either very obviously do not connect and some things could connect, but maybe they don't. And so really throughout the rest of this chapter, there's a case to be made that these things are not connected to verses 1 through 3. There's a case to be made that they are connected. I'll try to explore both of those a little bit at least. So here in verses 4 through 12, we really see more observations on labor. And it seems like if these are connected, then this is labor in connection to the corporate ladder, trying to climb up to the top and get this power that's in verses 1 through 3. And I think we're going to see that as we look at it. So let's read verses 4 through 6. Verses 4 through 6. He says, I have seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. This too is vanity and striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. One handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after wind. And so when we look at verse 4, there's a phrase that just immediately comes to my mind from verse 4. I've seen that every labor and every skill which is done is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. Anybody have a phrase or something that you're thinking of when you see those verses, those words? That's exactly what I was thinking. Yeah, that sounds a lot like keeping up with the Joneses. You know, your 97 Camry works just fine. It gets you where you need to go just fine until Bob down the road gets a brand new, I don't know, something nice. And then all of a sudden you start to notice this is a 97 Camry and it's starting to look like a 97 Camry. He's like, well, I got to get a new car. Or so-and-so got a new house. They got a new phone. So now I got to get a new house. I got to get a new phone. And keeping up with the Joneses is exactly what I think this verse is talking about. Every labor and every skill is the result of rivalry between a man and his neighbor. Does this happen in other neighborhoods where one guy starts mowing the yard and then you hear a bunch of other mowers start going off? I don't know if that's rivalry all the time, but it certainly is some of the time. And Solomon seems to have seen some of that. But Solomon says this is vanity and this is striving after the wind. And if we think about this in connection with verses 1 through 3, if this is sort of a rise to power, you think about in the workplace. If you get hired on at the same time as somebody else, and then all of a sudden one of you gets a promotion and the other one doesn't, what usually happens? Usually it's okay. I don't know. Probably for most of us in the room, it's probably okay. But sometimes there's a little tension that gets created there. We were hired at the same time. We've been working here the same amount of time, been doing the same things, and you got a promotion and I didn't. And so then we see sort of that tension that starts to happen. Yes, sir.
Is that always bad enough?
Well, that's a good question.
Like, it makes me achieve, it makes me compete. And a lot of, I guess we can also find that iron sharpens iron, right? So even with the apostles, like if someone being more effective and it fired them up to be more effective or to do better, or you'll see it in churches. That church is growing and we're not growing. All of a sudden, maybe we need to be more active, or there's things we're not doing, or it lets you look at yourself a little bit. I just wonder.
Yeah, I do think a lot of it comes down to the heart of the matter. Like what are the intentions and motives behind it? Especially because what we see in verse 4 is that it's rivalry between a man and his neighbor. And I think that suggests jealousy or envy. And if it's as a result of that, then that could be a problem. But if it's just, hey, we want to do well like they're doing well, then that's probably different for sure. But if it is rivalry and jealousy and envy, I would say that that's probably problematic. Either way, right here, Solomon says it's vanity and it's striving after wind. You know, all these labors and working so hard, and really we're going to see working yourself to death is sort of what's being mentioned here. He says that's useless because of what we're going to notice in just a few minutes. Yes, sir.
Yeah, let's be careful on the jealousy part. It depends on how that's used in Romans. One of the things that the Apostle Paul says, I wish that, for nothing else, that bringing the gospel of Christ, the salvation through Christ to the Gentiles, would make my fellow brethren jealous that you're receiving the promises that came to them. So in that way, jealousy would be good because they would see, wait a minute, this is a better cup, and I want that.
Yeah.
But that's obviously not something of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good distinction because you just said that's not of the world. And that's a really good distinction because we know that from Ecclesiastes 4 anyway, at this point, it's life under the sun without God. But with God, like God is a jealous God. How could jealousy be wrong? God's a jealous God. Yeah, I think that's a great distinction to bring up there. Any other thoughts so far to this point? Yes, sir.
David, Solomon's already talked about perspective in chapter 2, that working and enjoying the fruit of your labor is a gift of God.
Mm-hmm.
So clearly that's good. And I couldn't help but think of, I don't know where it is in Proverbs, but somewhere in Proverbs it talks about someone who's really skilled at his craft and standing before kings.
Mm.
And I know that's a truism, but it's presented in a positive way. We clearly know from cause we're supposed to do our very best effort, but not just about glory to ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
We need to be known as a really good worker and employee, or even boss if that's a title. But it's just about crushing others. You know what I mean? But I think we need to work hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a gift to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great perspective here, because at the end of chapter 2, he's talking about the gift of God is to work hard and enjoy the fruits of your labor. That's a gift from God. And I think what we see the difference here is that this is under the sun. We don't see God mentioned at all in chapter 4, which is fascinating to me. When God comes in the picture, things shift pretty significantly. But God isn't mentioned at all in chapter 4. And we have under the sun mentioned 1, 2, 3, 4 times in this chapter. And so that really helps us to distinguish what plane we're talking about. That's a bad way to say it. But talking about work, it's not that work is wrong. I do think it's a lot behind who it's for. So in verse 4, we have, it's about rivalry between a man and his neighbor. So it's all about me. And it's all about what I want and what I'm going after. And I think verses 5 and 6 really help us with this and on the proper distinction between this. Because verse 5, he says, the fool folds his hands and consumes his own flesh. Charlie just mentioned Proverbs. There's all kinds of Proverbs about the fool who is lazy and just doesn't work. So the fool folds his hands. That implies sleeping or rest, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. So he folds his hands and he consumes his own flesh. I think that's laziness, not being willing to work at all and not getting after what you need to get after to get done what you need to get done. Fool folds his hands and it consumes his own flesh. And then on verse 6, we get one handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor and striving after wind. So I really like what Solomon does here. So you have the fool folds his hands and rest, but then look at the other extreme of it at the second half of verse 6, 2 fists full of labor. So which one of those is good? 2 hands folded to rest or 2 fists full of labor? Solomon's answer is neither one of those is good. If you're folding your hands, you're too lazy to do any work, you're going to consume your own flesh. That's not good. But if you have 2 fists full of labor and you are striving and just, elbowing and scratching and clawing to make your way to the top of this corporate ladder, Solomon says that's not good either. But he does say 1 handful of rest is better than 2 fists full of labor. So it seems like 1 hand of rest, 1 hand of labor. So it's a balance between not working yourself to death, not being lazy and not working at all. And really that balance is, I think what Solomon's talking about is contentment. Not killing yourself so that you can get that new car to make your neighbor who doesn't care about you at all think that you're better than them somehow, or working so hard to get that new house so that everybody can say, oh, wow, look at that house, when nobody really cares that much. Yes, sir, you got your hand up.
Yeah, it's a subtle distinction, the hands full of live, so that's basically implying the fruits of your labor, whatever it is that you're working to have, bigger crops or bigger houses or bachelor vineyards or whatever it is, but those are just as meaningless as the labor.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I love the language here, the contrast with the hands. That's such a visual thing that I think we can understand, and it really helps us to understand what's going on here. So he says, it's not good to be a fool and be lazy and just fold your hands and rest all the time and not work at all. He says, that's not good. But it's also not good to have 2 hands full of labor and just work yourself to death trying to keep up with the Joneses or maybe climb up this corporate ladder. He says, that's not good either. What is good, what's better is 1 handful of rest and 1 hand of labor. And so a balance there, contentment. I think about, Charlie mentioned Proverbs earlier. In Proverbs, I think it's Proverbs 15. Let me look at this. Proverbs 15. And I think it's in the middle there. Yeah, Proverbs 15 and verses 16 and 17. This is one of my favorites. If we were allowed to have favorites of the Proverbs, but Proverbs 15 verses 16 and 17. I should remember that better. 15, 16, 17. That'll be pretty easy to remember. Here in this proverb, it says, better is a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil with it. Better is a dish of vegetables, or your version might actually say herbs there, where love is, than a fattened ox served with hatred. And so I think that fits really well with, you've got every labor and every striving and every skill which is done is rivalry between a man and his neighbor. And just doing everything, working so hard that you can say, I've got better stuff than you've got. Well, the wisdom of the proverb says it's better to have little with the fear of the Lord. It's better to have this sort of meager looking meal where love is than to have the best things and turmoil with it. So I think that really fits well. And really what Solomon's talking about is contentment here. Not striving so hard, killing yourself to get all this stuff, it's rivalry, or climb the corporate ladder, but be content with what you have and work hard for it. Okay, any thoughts on any of that?
Just that, that's exactly what the apostle Paul. Different places he taught, particularly Timothy, Thessalonians. I don't know why it's still on.
Yeah.
He prayed that for all
Mm-hmm.
living king,
Mm-hmm.
but he also, in Thessalonians, what was his, what rules did he have? Those who are not willing to work, but not eat.
Yeah.
So that's me the same balance there.
Yeah, for sure. If you couldn't hear, Brett was just talking about what Paul says in the New Testament a couple of times, like now that I just started rephrasing, I forgot the first thing that you said, but if a man doesn't work, neither shall he eat. Oh yeah. And also I pray for everyone, all men everywhere, that they would live a peaceful and quiet life. So that balance is taught in the New Testament as well. Hey, any other thoughts? Okay. Well, let's go through verses 7 through 12, because it's almost like if these things are connected, and they might not be, so just be aware they might not be, but if this whole chapter is connected, each one of these paragraphs is connected, verses 7 through 12 reads almost like a case study of someone who did exactly the opposite of what, almost said Paul, what Solomon is giving wisdom about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And so here in verses 7 through 12, let's read these verses. He says, then I looked again at vanity under the sun. There was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. Indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? Well, this too is vanity, and it is a grievous task. Two are better than one, because they have a good return for their labor. For if either of them falls, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there is not another to lift him up. Furthermore, if two lie down together, they keep warm. But how can one be warm alone? And if one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn. And so here, especially in verses 7 and 8, and I do think that 7 through 12 is all connected, but in verses 7 through 8, it's almost like a case study of what he's just been talking about. Then he says, here's this man who didn't have any dependents. He didn't have a son, didn't have a brother, nobody to share the fruits of his labors with, if you will. And yet there was no end to all his labor. He just said, one handful of rest, one handful of labor. That's the balance you want. But he says there was no end to all of his labor. So this guy's got 2 fists full of labor. He is striving, doing every single thing that he can. He said, indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches. And so that really points us to keeping up with the Joneses there. Never satisfied with riches, or verses 1 through 3, climbing that corporate ladder to get power or whatever it is. And he never asked, and for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? So this is not just, well, he's a really hard worker. He's a good man. He's a really hard worker. Look at what this question that he should be asking himself is, for whom am I laboring? He's like, it seems like I've got more stuff than I need for just myself. Who am I laboring for? But then also he says, for whom am I depriving myself for? So it's not just labor. He is depriving himself by all this labor. 2 fistful. He's not getting any rest. He is just striving and laboring and working as hard as he can. And he never thought to ask the question, who's all this for? Because it's just him. And if it's just him, Solomon says, this is vanity. This is a grievous task. I have no one to share it with. And I think that's significant because then the next section is two are better than one. And you get this whole thing about, if one is lying down alone, how can they keep warm? But you need someone to keep them warm. Or three is better than one. It's all that stuff. I think that's really significant. And so Solomon here is saying, it's vanity. It's a grievous task to just endlessly labor and strife and have no one to share it with. He says that's vanity. It's a grievous task. Any thoughts on verses 7 and 8 before we keep going? Okay. Let's see here. And I do think that this might connect, if these things are connected anyway, to verses 1 through 3, and then with verse 4 there too, where all of this striving is for himself. And it's almost like this man reaches the top, he reaches the pinnacle, and then he should be asking the question, why have I been doing all this? I have no one to share it with, and this isn't fun anymore. Could be a way to say that. So then here we see some wisdom. These read like proverbs about companionship and how companionship is good. In verse 9, he says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. Now, what's interesting about this to me is this sounds very business-like to me. This doesn't sound like just relationship, maybe a married couple. It sounds like two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. One can rest while the other works, or one can work while the other rests. And it's talking about business returns almost. And we could relate that to just relationships, but it sounds a lot more like business here. And then if either one of them falls or fails, your version might say, the one will lift up his companion. But woe to the one who falls when there's not another to lift him up. And so just physical safety, physical trials or troubles or things that come up. I was reading and thinking about this, and something that came up was talking about some older people who live on their own, and maybe they don't have anybody that comes in to check on them. And if they fall and they can't get up, that is a serious problem, isn't it? And so companionship is a very important thing for all ages. But I mean, just thinking about it, if you fall and can't get up, that's a really big deal. That's a really scary thing. And that's why Solomon says it's good to have more than one person around. And so verse 11, furthermore, I think just continuing the thought, if two lie down together, they can keep warm, but how can one be warm alone? There's some really practical things here. They don't have indoor heat unless they have a fire going and all that stuff. So you got to keep warm somehow, and having other people can help them. Protection in verse 12, physical protection and safety. If one can overpower him who is alone, two can resist him. Physical safety. It's good to have people around. And then a cord of 3 strands is not quickly torn apart. Rope isn't just one string or anything like that. It's cords put together. Or have you done the thing with the pencils? You can just snap one pencil, but if you get a little handful of pencils, you can't snap all those. There is strength in numbers here. It's important for business success, for support, and really strength and protection in anything. Could be spiritual, could be emotional, could be physical health or safety. It's good to have people around. Now, from my school psychology practice, there's all kinds of little psychological hacks that people like to come up with. And one of them is HALT, H-A-L-T. And H-A-L-T stands for hungry, angry, lonely, and tired. And basically the advice is, if you're hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you need to halt. Don't make any big decisions. Don't blow up on anybody. Don't have that argument right now, because those things, they can sort of sway and influence the way that you go through a situation that you might not otherwise. The L in that is lonely. Have you ever heard or seen or experienced or done yourself things that you're not proud of when you've been lonely, or things that you wish you could take back when you're lonely? Probably so. And so I think that's some of the wisdom that's being given here. Two are better than one. Companionship is good, even if it's just business, but relationships, having people around you is good. And that's important for us, because we can do a lot of things that we shouldn't do when we're lonely, or we can make decisions that we would look back and say, I wish I had done that different when we're lonely. So HALT, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. And a lot of times that affects the way you're thinking about it. You don't think about, man, I haven't eaten in 12 hours. I should probably do that before I blow up on this person. Anyway, any thoughts on any of that before we keep going? Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Parallel to the New Testament and the church. Yeah, God's wisdom is ultimate for sure, that we need one another. Okay, any other thoughts? Okay, let's do verses 13 through 16 here. 13 through 16. A poor yet wise lad is better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. For he has come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in his kingdom. I have seen all the living under the sun throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. There is no end to all the people, to all who were before them, and even the ones who will come later will not be happy with him. For this too is vanity and striving after wind. Again, this might not connect, but if it is connected, this seems to match pretty well with verses 1 through 3 about sort of corporate ladder and rising up and oppression that comes as a result of that. Because here's this poor yet wise lad. He has wisdom, seems like earthly wisdom under the sun, but he's better than an old and foolish king who no longer knows how to receive instruction. So somebody who he's been in power for a while and nobody can tell him anything. Nobody can tell him, hey, you should do this. Maybe you want to think about doing that, because he's not going to listen to it. I've been king for however many years and you're trying to tell me what to do? No way. And people don't like that, right? You don't like that. Somebody who's a leader or an authority figure or power, and I'm just not going to listen to you. They don't like that. And so Solomon says that he's seen people throng to the side of the second lad who replaces him. Verse 14 is interesting because it says he's come out of prison to become king, even though he was born poor in the kingdom. It's sort of ambiguous as to which one specifically is being talked about. I tend to think that it's talking about the second one, about the poor wise lad. He's come out of this really lowly position and he's going to be raised up to the kingship. Maybe not. But either way, in verse 15, Solomon says, I've seen that all who are living under the sun, they throng to the side of this young, wise lad instead of this king who's foolish and old and won't listen to anybody. And they're happy. They're happy because this second wise young lad rises to be the king and replaces this king that they don't like. But then verse 16 is just so interesting and so like Ecclesiastes, because he says, well, there's no end to all the people, to all who are before them. And guess what? Even the ones who are going to come later, they're not going to be happy with this young, wise lad that everybody was happy with for a little while. They're not going to like him anymore. And so then they're just going to replace him. And this is vanity and it's striving after wind. And so if all of this is sort of corporate ladder, rising up the ranks and connecting to verses 1 through 3, the idea is even that power, even that ability to be the oppressor is fleeting. And the people who really shout rah rah and are rooting for you just as much as they can when you come to power, just give it a few years. Some people are not going to realize what you did or what you replaced or who you replaced and how much better you are or worse, because you're just going to become that old foolish king who you're not going to listen to anybody and you're just going to be replaced and nobody. And Solomon says that's vanity and that's striving after wind. Yes, sir.
Is historic commentary or just all hypothetical?
That's a great question. I wondered the exact same thing, because if you think about Saul, when Saul was king, there was a period of time where you couldn't tell him anything. Prophets would come, prophets would say things. Samuel would tell him things, and I'm going to go consult a medium so I can talk to Samuel again, which is crazy. And so maybe he's talking about Saul, who was this older king and would not listen to people, would not listen to his advisors and all of that. And then here's this poor yet wise lad in David, maybe, who rises up the ranks, although he's in prison for a while because he's on the run from Saul. And then he becomes king and everybody's happy for a while. But then maybe this is Solomon looking, if Solomon's near the end of his life here, maybe Solomon is looking around and he's seeing all these people who weren't alive when Saul or David was king. Or maybe they don't even realize how good of a king David was and how bad of a king that Saul became or any of that stuff. So maybe he's observing people and saying, here I am, I've been king, and I'm looking around and they don't really know who Saul or David was. They might hear the stories and know all this stuff, but they didn't really experience it. And maybe they were happy when I was king, but now maybe people are not so happy because of his heavy taxes. So it's a great question. I don't really know, but it does fit, I think, a little bit at least here with what Solomon might be experiencing at this point in his life. Any other thoughts or comments? Yes, sir.
In Israel's history, you have Joseph, who became a poor lad with wisdom, and then eventually rose to a position where he could basically save Egypt and his own family, and then later on the whole nation that would come from his family.
And then you fast forward to the beginning of Exodus, Pharaoh that arises and doesn't know God. And we could consider him a foolish king who no longer pays attention to warnings.
Mm-hmm.
And it led his kingdom into desolation for a time. And so, I mean, there definitely is precedent for it in history. And then you can look forward, you think basically to Daniel's time, and you may have a young lad there who certainly probably was royalty, but came to poverty as he went into Babylon. And so you kind of have an ongoing theme throughout the whole thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting about all of this too is you can read where some people suggest that maybe one of the points that Solomon is getting at, if it's not sort of a picture of what actually we see happen throughout history and in the scriptures and elsewhere, is that maybe this is from a perspective of the people who are just tired of this king who's been king for a while. And so in their eyes, they're like, oh, he's foolish. He won't listen to anybody. When maybe that's not even the case. Maybe that's just what they perceive this older king to be. And really, they're just tired of that king being in power. And so they usher in this wise young lad just to replace that old guy, get him out of there. And people, there's a couple of different people who suggest that. Either way that we look at it, I think the message is the same. It's that even if you rise to power, that power is fleeting. You can rise up to the highest levels of whatever it is, but even that is fleeting. And people who come later either aren't going to remember you, or they're going to remember you in a way that you don't want to be remembered, which is interesting here too. They might change some of the narratives around who you are and how you rose to power. And I do think that this is important because this can happen in congregations as well, can it not? I mean, it's like, oh, that preacher, he's really getting up there and his messages aren't really relevant anymore. Let's get this young guy in here and replace him so we can be happy again. And then it's fascinating when that young guy starts preaching the same lessons as that older guy. It's like, oh, that was a great lesson. Like that guy's been preaching that for a couple of years. And we see that happen. By the way, I'm not saying that happened here because I got a couple weird looks just now. I'm not saying that's what happened here. But it does happen in places, doesn't it? It does. And it's sort of the human experience. And I think Solomon is pointing that out as well. Okay. Another thing we can see in this is that wisdom is still important. Even if it is under the sun, wisdom still is important. We've seen Solomon say, I think it was in chapter 2, that he observed that wisdom is better. It excels as light excels darkness. So wisdom is good, even if it's life under the sun. But on how we use that, if it's just for power, if it's just for ourselves, if it's just keeping up with the Joneses, Solomon would say it's vanity and it's striving after wind. Okay. Any thoughts or anything on any of chapter 4? Okay. Wow. All right. Let's see. Yes, sir.
The boastful pride of life is one of the three ways that we tend to write. And I can see how, as a person gets older, that temptation maybe overtakes, or that risk, that way to be tempted, maybe is more powerful than it was when you're younger. Because, you can just be filled with, I've got a lot of experiences. I've done this, I've seen that, and I think at least I can observe it as something to be on guard for me, right? Because we're just older in many ways are wiser, but that doesn't mean we can't understand it. I can learn from the youngest to the oldest. So that's just something I've observed, the lust of the flesh and see the lust of the eye, seeming to be able to that very strong when younger, but maybe as you learn and mature and get better at overcoming those things. But I think the pride of life increases temptation, possibly as we age.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Potentially.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we could become the older ruler who just nobody can tell him anything because we got it figured out. All right. Anything else? Any of these? Okay. Well, Lord willing, next week, I'd like to cover 5 and 6. 5 and 6 if we can, because we're gonna have one less week than normal, or not really the normal, but to fit into this quarter, do 5 and 6 next week. And one of the things I want to notice is in chapter 4, we have not seen God specifically mentioned once in chapter 4. We saw it in chapter 3, and right at the beginning of chapter 5, if you want to look at this really quickly with me, in verse 1, we see the house of God. In verse 2, we see the presence of God. We see God is in heaven in verse 2. Let's see, in verse 4, when you make God be angry on your account. In verse 7, at the end of verse 7, rather fear God. And then at the end of chapter 5, in verse 18, the end of verse 18, during the few years of his life which God has given him, this is his reward. Verse 19, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth. The end of verse 19, this is the gift of God. Verse 20, he will not often consider the years of his life because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. So chapter 4 is pretty bleak, is it not? I mean, it's a rough picture of life under the sun, but chapter 5 is going to be filled with God, and that's going to be really important. It's a very big difference as we go through the book. Okay, any last comments before we close? All right, well, please read 5 and 6 for next Sunday. Thank you.